Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. After what seemed to be an endless primary and election cycle, it all came down to November 4th, when we elected a new president. What does the vote say about our ability to look past color, religion, and ideology? To help guide us, we turn to Professor Ariela J. the John B. and Alice R. Sharp Professor of Law and History at the University of Southern California. Her latest book, What Blood Won't Tell, A History of Race on Trial in America, has just been published by Harvard University Press. It's a revealing look at how we have defined race throughout this country's history. And not to belabor any metaphors, it is not a black and white picture. I'm delighted you can join us today, celebrating the historic election of Barack Obama, the 44th President of the United States.
Thank you for having me.
We live in a country that even now is very much hung up on race. Race rears its head in how people are treated in the criminal justice system, in the education system, in how people are portrayed in the movies, in our attitudes toward immigrants, and in politics. And yet the central message of your book is that race is not based on anything scientific, that it's a concept created by law, often for social, political, or economic reasons.
That's right. I think the title of my book is What Blood Won't Tell, and I picked the title for two reasons. I think that we have this idea still today that race is something in your blood, a fact of nature, and as much as the scientists have told us that's not true, I think that's still part of our racial common sense, if you like. But the other part of that common sense is that idea that blood will tell, that this thing which is intrinsic to us is going to reveal itself in the way we behave and determine our character in some way. And that idea, I think, is still with us, even among people who would say, no, I don't believe in any scientific or biological basis for race. And that, I think, was something of a surprise in my research, that racism, even in the past, wasn't just based on a now discredited racial science, but also on the idea that race is defined by the way people perform their identity.
Mm-hmm. Now, you open your book with the court case of Alexina Morrison, a slave woman in Louisiana in 1857, who looked white, even though probably had some black blood, African blood in her, and who took her master to court claiming she was white and had been unlawfully enslaved, and a jury of white men granted her her freedom. Why is this case significant?
So this is one of the first of what I call racial identity trials that I came across while doing research on something else. And I was so struck by the hundreds of pages of testimony because, as you say, her master has all the documents to prove that she and her mother belonged in slavery, had been his slave, the slaves of his family for generations.
And if you use the one-drop rule, she'd definitely be
and you know, and therefore, right, if we're looking at ancestry, he has the proof, he has the documents on his side. But she runs away to her jailer. He takes her home to his family. He believes her story and introduces her into white society, and she wins over the community to such an extent that her master actually claims that when he went to file his answer in the court, he's mobbed by white citizens who want to lynch him. So on the one hand, it's this incredible story of human agency that this poor enslaved woman takes things into her own hands and remarkably resourceful, and tells a story that wins over a white community. And on the other hand, right, the story that she has to tell to gain her freedom is ultimately reinforcing white supremacy. She has to prove that she's white and reinforce this ideal of white womanhood in order to gain her freedom, because people still believe that's the only reason she should have her freedom. Another thing that's interesting about it is that these stories of enslaved women who sue for their freedom get picked up by fugitive slaves who go to the North, become part of the abolitionist anti-slavery movement, and write their stories. And they tell stories of people like Alexina as part of a weapon in the war against slavery, to show, look, this could happen to anyone, even a woman with blonde hair and blue eyes. So, her story has this double-edged quality.
Now, were blacks the first group of Americans to be branded a race?
Yes. And I think it's a complicated history to go back to the earliest colonial times and say, were the first Africans who were brought to American shores enslaved because of the racial ideology of the first British colonists, or was it only after they had enslaved Africans for some time, participated in the slave trade for some time, that they developed a full-blown kind of racial ideology? But one thing that you see very early, certainly by the time I begin my story in the early Republic, I think you see this by the 17th century, of strong differentiation between the way the British saw Africans and Indians. And while there was plenty of racial differentiation with Indians, they saw them as savages and were willing to kill them and steal their land. The racial ideology that develops is these are a separate people, a nation who is less civilized than whites, but could be perhaps could change. Whereas to justify enslaving and permanently degrading Africans, whites develop an ideology that these are a people who could never improve, who could never become assimilated, who are irredeemably inferior. And that full-blown racist ideology really develops to justify enslaving people in a republic that's supposedly based on freedom. And
it's quite possible that if Indians had worked out a little better as slaves, that they wouldn't have been regarded as a nation, but would have been regarded as a race that we can then enslave.
Indians had some resources because they lived there first, so they had some resources to draw on to fight back. Africans are taken from many different nations. They come here. So many died in the Middle Passage. They don't have those resources to fight.
One thing you point out is that, Indians and Africans were very much intermingled. I was surprised to know that some Indian tribes had owned slaves, but, they had also intermarried, lived together. You had blacks who were very much part of Indian tribes and treated as such. But after the Civil War, when the federal government was doing the land allotment to Indians, we're going to give you so much of this land that you used to own outright, designations of who was Indian and who was a freed slave became very important and was used as a way of cutting down on the population of Indian tribes, so you didn't have to give as much land away. Tell me about that.
That's right. I mean, so two things. First of all, I too was surprised as I did the research on Native Americans to discover the amount of intermixture among African Americans and Indians early in our history. Just the number of people who survived for decades of the 19th century with a kind of ambiguous or intermediate racial identity, and the number of Indian groups that were multiracial. But as Jim Crow is really coming into being in the late 19th century, that becomes more and more difficult. And under land allotment, which is going on in what's now Oklahoma, Indian Territory, the Seminole Nation, the Cherokee Nation, the Indian tribes that are there, right? They're getting enrolled on these lists that the government is coming around. They're setting up tents in Indian territory and saying, okay, you go to the Indian tent, you go to the Negro tent. And they didn't always use such a nice word. They did that quite arbitrarily, and people at the time didn't realize how much difference it was going to make. One of the most tragic things is hearing the court testimony that comes, from the pages of these old transcripts. People saying, we had no idea what difference it would make. They told us we'd get land either way, whether we were Negro or Indian. And a year later, Oklahoma sets down the most racist state constitution of any state in the Union, a totally Jim Crow constitution, and it says, blacks are completely excluded from every form of public life that there is, and Indians are defined as white. And so now that line makes an enormous difference whether you ended up on the Indian roll or the Negro roll. And to this day, the Seminole Nation and the Cherokee Nation are involved in litigation in their own courts and in federal courts over excluding their African American citizens from citizenship. Money, there's a lot of money at stake,
right?
And that's still that definition of Indian identity by blood is still a big issue for all tribes. And it's the legacy of Jim Crow, and I think that's something we haven't quite realized is how much that idea of blood quantum and blood in Indian nations is also the legacy of Jim Crow. Right,
and my understanding is there are some groups, even some on Long Island, where you have people who are trying to prove that they are Indian so that they can, they're thinking about casinos and benefits that are available, and trying to prove that they're Indian, and not necessarily having much success with it.
And and if you look at some of the tribes in the Northeast that have had long battles over tribal recognition, federal recognition, the Narragansett, the Mashpee, often the way that they get detribalized and that they lose their Indian identity is because they are considered mixed with black, with African Americans. That is what makes them seem no longer Indian to the white majority. And you can see that going way back to the Mashpee Indians who were in Massachusetts. They were way back in the 17th century. People already saying, "Oh, they're not really Indian anymore because they absorbed African sailors."
Right.
And still to this day, that's the question: how really Indian are they if they could incorporate Africans as members?
Right. Fascinating. We're going to take a short break. I'll be back with more with Professor Ariela J after the following message.
From all walks of life and every corner of the globe, old friends and new, the experienced and the novice. Some have come for years, and some are just getting started. Habitat volunteers share their time and their hearts with families in need, offering hope for a better life. Won't you join us in your hometown or wherever your heart leads you? Volunteer, get involved, and help build it.
Welcome back to One to One. I'm Sheryl McCarthy, and I'm talking with Ariela J. Gross, Professor of Law and History at the University of Southern California. She's the author of What Blood Won't Tell, A History of Race on Trial in America, which has just been published by Harvard University Press. These arbitrary racial designations in terms of deciding who got land and certain privileges was also applied to Hawaiians, correct? Tell me a little something about how that played out.
Yes, that's right. In the early 1920s, Hawaii, which of course was an independent nation conquered by the United States at the end of the 19th century, Hawaii follows the same pattern that happened on the mainland of allotting land to individual native peoples, basically taking the large amount of land that had belonged to them, giving small bits to individuals, and then saying the rest is surplus. And in the Hawaiian case, giving it to the ranch companies and the big sugar companies. And in Hawaii, just as on the mainland, it introduces for the first time the idea of blood as the arbiter of identity, which hadn't been part of the definition before of who was Hawaiian. And in the legislative debates in the territories and then in the Senate and Congress, you see the most really quite explicit discussions of, well, if we define Native Hawaiian as, 1/32nd, which was the first possibility, that would mean a lot of people getting land, but if we make it 1/2, it will be fewer people. And they end up with a definition of you have to have 1/2 Native Hawaiian ancestry in order to have access to land.
Which really hurt the Hawaiians because they were, like the Native Americans, they were very much racially mixed as well.
Hawaii had been lauded, in fact, as one of the places, and Barack Obama, coming from Hawaii, it's a place where there were people from the Philippines, Japan, white settlers, and Chinese, and as well as the Native Hawaiians. And in Congress, in the congressional debates, you can see this discussion of, a Hawaiian-Chinese mix makes a good laborer. And, they have all of these racial stereotypes about different groups.
And by the time they finished defining, a Hawaiian is somebody who had 50% original, Hawaiian ancestry, there weren't very many Hawaiians left. Right?
That's right. It comes about as a fear of this is a dying race. We need to rehabilitate a dying race, and this is the way to do it. And of course, by introducing blood, which is the same thing that's happened with Indian groups as well, moving from what had been a really political definition of here is a nation that owns land, and now we have some land that is held in trust for them because it belonged to them, and these are the descendants of the people who own the land. We now move to this idea that actually this is a racial identity, and therefore maybe there's something suspect about holding the land for them. So that 7 years ago, the Supreme Court of the United States decided a very important case that said for the first time, Native Hawaiian identity is a racial classification, so it's not legitimate to allow only Hawaiians to vote for the trustees of the land. But that's really misguided when you consider that this is the trustees of their land.
Right. So it really turns that arbitrary racial definition of Hawaiians against them.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And it makes us forget that what we're really talking about is a conquered nation.
Right, right. Were there certain groups that started off being treated as non-white who have been able to become white because of their accomplishments?
So it's interesting. In the historical profession, there's been a great burgeoning of whiteness studies in the last years, and many books have been written about how different groups, usually European, became white,
like how the Irish became white, right.
How Jews became white, and so on. And I came into this research already, I think, a little bit skeptical about that idea, but I was really convinced in doing the research that there was a really significant difference between Europeans and other groups of immigrants to American shores. That Europeans were, in many important respects, white on arrival, and so I do make a distinction.
WOA.
Yes. I take that from a wonderful book by a historian named Tom Guglielmo, who writes about the Italians, and he says they were actually white on arrival. And There's both aspect of formal citizenship, right, becoming naturalized to citizenship to the United States, from which until 1952 we excluded everyone who couldn't show they were a free white person. And
I found that amazing. I had not known that.
Isn't that
until
amazing?
That recently.
Isn't that amazing? Now, after the Civil War, we added or African nativity because African Americans officially became formal citizens, although they weren't getting all the other rights. But no immigrant came in and said, I'm of African nativity. They all tried to claim they were white, and that failed for immigrants from China, Japan, India, most of Asia. And the only immigrants who were able to make that claim successfully were those, interestingly, from the Near East. Europeans weren't even challenged. It was never a question that they were white for formal citizenship. I also talk about what I call the full rights of social and political citizenship, things like the right to vote, the right to marry a white person, to marry across racial lines, the right to sit on a jury. Jury service has been a key element of national belonging in our society. And even Mexican Americans who, because of the treaty that ended the Mexican-American War, gained formal citizenship, were in Texas and California, where there were large numbers, excluded from that full social and political citizenship. You don't see any Europeans, although they did face important discrimination. I don't, deny that. I'm Jewish, and Jewish immigrants at the turn of the century couldn't enter most of the professions and faced discrimination in housing, and there were important ways that racists saw them as racially different, but they were never excluded from voting. They were never excluded from sitting on juries and or from marrying other whites.
Other white
and
people.
That is what allowed them to enter into American society and overcome those barriers, because voting allowed the Irish to create political machines, and intermarrying allowed them to assimilate, and those were things that were denied to
other
groups who were not seen as well.
So here we are in 2008, the day after Barack Obama has been elected president. And some people are claiming, well, this signifies that we have entered into a post-racial period. My sense is that you would disagree with that.
I do, and I want to acknowledge what an incredible day it is. It is just an historic event, and no matter what you believe, what your politics are, or what your party is, it's an historic day. And I do think it marks a generational shift, and I think it probably marks some ideological shift that's important. But one of the lessons that I think of our history is the durability of a certain kind of what I call the racial common sense. But the idea that even if we no longer believe in race as blood, that we still believe in race as the way people perform their identity, and that we haven't, courts, especially the last 10 years of conservative courts, have narrowed significantly their understanding of what racial discrimination is to a very narrow sense of it's only discrimination if it's blatantly about the color of someone's skin, and we've allowed all kinds of discriminatory practices on the basis of language, culture, and the way people perform their identity. And I think that until we can break that down, and I'm very hopeful that we're seeing a shift now to where that may change, but I think in my view, Barack Obama's candidacy was not about a post-racial politics, but about a new kind of politics of racial coalition that acknowledged our history of race and racism in order to move forward. That's my hope.
It has been argued by people like Ward Connolly out in California and some justices on the Supreme Court that the way to eliminate race as a problem is to eliminate all racial classifications in law, to become officially colorblind. But you don't agree.
No, and sometimes people hear this history and they say, oh, this is just about the absurdity of racial classification, and it's sort of a story of farce. And I guess I see much of the story as tragedy rather than farce. That it's not that these classifications don't work; it's that they work too well. And I think it's important to see not. What we're seeing is not classification, it's domination. That is, race isn't created just because people like to draw boundaries. People created race as a form of power and hierarchy. There was always a very specific purpose. And I think what I was trying to show is the way racism kind of shifts its ground as necessary to get the job done.
Right.
And that's the part that we have to combat. It's not, once we get rid of classification, it'll be taken care of. If we want to undo that hierarchy, we have to be as mobile in finding ways to combat that and
we also have to acknowledge the
harm.
Classification and how it works against people, and that's the only way we can really address how
I think Thurgood Marshall said it several decades ago, right? But until we can't not see race if we're trying to redress it, we have to see something to undo it.
It's very fascinating, the way you point out the different ways that race has been manipulated over time for different ends. And people who want to learn about that should read your book, definitely. We're out of time, but I want to thank Ariela J. Gross, the John J. and Alice R. Sharp Professor of Law and History at the University of Southern California. Her book, What Blood Won't Tell, A History of Race on Trial in America, has just been published by Harvard University Press. For the City University of New York and One to One, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.